very much. The reason I gave this speech a few years ago when I was asked to join a group called the Friends of Lincoln History. And until that time, I really wasn't interested in doing much historical background checking. And as I got started, I was really sorry that I didn't talk to my parents more about what was happening and what had happened. And they didn't talk about it either. So much of my information tonight will come from two books that I researched. One is Exiles in Our Own Country by the Japanese Canadians in Niagara by Adachi, and it's a series of interviews with the Japanese in the Niagara Peninsula. Anyway, in the spring of 1877, Manzo Nagana was a stowaway on a British freighter, and he is supposed to be the first Japanese to be recognized in Canada. It wasn't until 1884 that the Japanese government permitted Japanese to emigrate to Canada and to the United States. So thousands of Japanese were located in British Columbia. However, because they were there, it didn't mean that they were given any rights. They couldn't hold public office, they couldn't become lawyers, they couldn't become pharmacists or become teachers, accounting. None of the jobs that meant anything. They were denied that privilege. By the 1930s, the Issei, which would be the first generation, had built communities in British Columbia around fishing and lumbering and dairy farms and market gardening. And so by that time, Powell Street in Vancouver had shops and hotels and restaurants. It was a Japanese community. And everything was fine, they had no vote, but people were able to survive there. Then on December the 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, everything changed. 1,800 Japanese fishermen were out of work in one day. All our ships were impounded, and there were rumors that all kinds of things were going to happen. There was a newspaper called the New Canadian. I think it's still, I don't know whether it's still a publication or not. I do know that my parents used to get it when they lived in Beamsville. They dismissed it as being silly that the liberal government would expel them from BC. Nobody believed that that would happen. On January the 14th, then, Order in Council designated area 100 miles from the Pacific Ocean eastward as a protected area, and that all male Japanese nationals 18 to 45 had to be removed and taken from that area. Everybody was assured that it was only a temporary measure, and that Japanese need not worry that this would not be for very long. 3 weeks later, Order in Council, all persons of Japanese racial origin were to be removed from this zone. So for 100 miles from the coast in, no one could be living there. And the War Measures Act legalized this government action. So all of a sudden, all Japanese Canadians became enemy aliens. And on March the 4th, 1942, the Security Commission was established, and a civilian body empowered to carry out a systematic expulsion of all persons of Japanese racial origin. and a custodian of enemy property was authorized to administer and hold in trust all properties and belongings. Now, this was happening in the United States at the same time. The same sort of law was passed. There was a dusk to dawn curfew, and without any warning, all cameras, radios were confiscated, cars were impounded. At this point, I was living in Great Central Lake, which is a logging town on Vancouver Island. Pictures of my dad and me here. That was taken from Great Central, and it was lumbering was a big industry at that time. Well, I guess it still is. And years later, I will tell you later on that we traveled back out there after watching the TV show Roots. I had to get back and find my roots, so I went back, took our family. Two of my daughters are here now. They got to travel west to find out my roots, and I'll tell you how disappointed that was. Anyway, at that point, families were given hours, days to get rid of anything they could sell, because we ended up being moved to Hastings Park in Vancouver, which is equivalent to the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds in Toronto. And barbed wire was put up around, and families were assigned horse stalls to live in. And I can remember little bits of it. I can remember cleaning out a stall beside my cousins, and only women and children were kept there. I do recall at one point growing up, I don't know why I remember this, other than we were sitting there and my mother was not eating, and all the kids had to eat, because it was a hunger strike by the adults, because the food was so bad that I guess, I don't know, eventually it must have got better because I'm still alive. Towns in the interior of British Columbia were being prepared as internment centers. So places like Greenwood, Caslow, New Denver, Slocan City, Lemon Creek were all places that are foreign to me because I never ended up in one of those. But I have a friend here who was actually born in one of those places. There were places that were constructed on vacant lands, and families were just sent there, and the buildings were not very good, and I guess reading about them, they were pretty cool. Pretty cold in the wintertime. I actually didn't have to go through all that, and I'll explain why. The Security Commission first tried to break up families, and groups of men began to protest, and so finally they were given notice that they were to go by train. Now, my father and my uncle ended up in Scriber, Ontario, and I never did ask him why, but I found out reading Ken Adachi's book that they were afraid of some of the young guys causing problems, so they packed them up and sent them to work on the Trans-Canada Highway, and Scriber was the location where my dad and my uncle ended up. Over 100 of the young guys refused to go, and so the RCMP jailed them, and they were sent to prisoner of war camps at Petawawa and at Angler, and they spent the whole of the war as prisoners of war in Ontario, separated from their families. between April and June of 1942, 470 were interned behind barbed wire without being charged with any crime, and they spent all of the war years as prisoners of war. In July of 1942, the family reunification policy made by the Security Council allowed them to get out of, I guess it could be jail. So 22,000 Japanese Canadians by November of 42 had been forcibly uprooted from their West Coast homes. By November of 1942, Security Commission had moved all Japanese Canadians out of the 100-mile zone. And in January 1943, Order in Council power to sell without owner's consent all properties that were initially held in trust were now sold. And the reason was that the money was to be used to feed the people that they had locked up. Now, just as an aside, the same thing happened in the United States, but when the war ended, all of the Japanese in the United States were allowed to go back to California, and all of their things that had been taken away were returned. In August of 1944, it was written by Mackenzie King, "It is a fact no person of Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage or disloyalty during the war years." And it was at the House of Commons, the Prime Minister Mackenzie King said that. In 1945, following the war, Japanese Americans were allowed to return to the West Coast, but in Canada, Japanese Canadians now required to choose between two things: dispersal east of the Rockies or go back to Japan. You could not go back to British Columbia. So those were the choices. In 1946, the Supreme Court ruled under the War Measures Act that this was legal. Under pressure, Mackenzie King called it off, but it was too late. 4,000 Japanese had already been forced to return to Japan, and 1/3 of the children were under 18, and they were all born in Canada, but they're sent back to Japan. Now, I can imagine being sent back to Japan after the war, going back to a pretty devastated country. So that's the basic story, and now I'm going to talk about my family. First of all, my family is the Sumi family, S-U-M-I. That should be my surname. And the Sumi family were market farmers on Main Island. Main Island is one of the coastal islands between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and it's south of Galliano. And Active Pass is the pass between the Vancouver Island and the mainland, and the ships go through there. And evidently, the Sumi family had a farm, they had greenhouses, and they sold produce to boats passing through. My family came from the prefecture of Tottori. It's in Honshu Island in Japan. And the family had 3 boys and 3 girls. There's a picture in there of two of my dad and my brother. I can't remember. That's it. That picture was taken in Beamsville, and my dad had an older brother, 2 older sisters, a younger brother, and a younger sister. His younger sister was my aunt that traveled with my mother, and I'll explain that in a minute. My dad was born in Canada. Now, I should also tell you that one of the things that I wished I had done years ago was ask more questions. But being a little guy and growing up in Beamsville and not talking about the war years, my parents never talked about anything unless I asked a specific question. And so I often wondered little things after the fact, like where was my dad born? I know he was born in Canada, but where and why? Those are the kinds of things. Now, why is my last name not Sumi? Well, evidently on Main Island, there was a family of Teshimas, and they were fishermen, and they were friends of the Sumis. And so when my dad was born and they got around to registering the birth in Victoria, the family asked would they call him a Teshima so the family surname would go on. And so they did. My dad did not ever live with them, but his last name was Teshima from that point on, even though, and this is quite interesting because when I was younger, and my cousin Tom Sumi came to live to visit for a week in Beamsville, try to explain to somebody, how are you guys cousins? Oh, our fathers are brothers. And people would look at us like, yeah, sure. And then the other part of that was so funny too was growing up in Beamsville, if we passed any people I knew, mostly ladies that lived in the community, I would nod or say hello. And my cousin finally stopped me once and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Why do you have to nod your head or say hello to everybody that we pass?" I said, "If I don't, somebody will complain to my mother that I ignored them as I was walking by." Well, my cousin tapped me on the shoulder. He says, "Next week when you come to Toronto, don't you do that or we'll be in trouble." And I never thought about it, but I guess growing up in Beamsville, that's what was expected of me. Now, I grew up in Great Central, which is a logging town, and the pictures of my dad and me there. It was a community that I grew up in, and I knew no different. All the kids were Japanese, as far as I can remember, and it was a large community. My dad played on a ball team. He was a hunter, and the reason I point that out is that rifle becomes part of the story later on. But he was a hunter and a fisherman, and when war was declared and we were told that we had to leave Great Central, one of my dad's friends with whom he hunted, a mounted policeman, had to take my dad's rifle from him. And I remember my dad mentioning that to me only because in 1945 I was outside playing and a car pulled up and two guys got out and they had this package and it was my dad's rifle. And it was the only thing that we know of that anybody ever got back. And we feel it was because his friend was a Mountie who had taken it away from him and made sure that he got it back. And I wanted to find that gun, but my dad got rid of it in a hurry because it brought back too many bad memories. So unfortunately, we didn't get that. Now, excuse me. I can remember as a child running down this big steep hill every time the whistle went at the factory to meet my dad. And years later, I'll tell you what happened on my return. But those are the kinds of things that I remember as growing up as a child. And going to ball games, watching my dad be a catcher. I remember falling off of the stands and cutting my head and ending up in the infirmary in the sawmill. And the medic patching me up. I don't know why I remember something like that, but I do. So the reason I wanted to show you that was he was a hunter, a fisherman, and that rifle was returned. And I told a friend of mine who's a ex-Mountie about that at the golf course, and he said, Ken, I got to tell my friends about that because that's a good Mountie story. No, we are in Hastings Park. My dad and my uncle and a bunch of people, men, are gone. I remember the food hunger strike, but I don't remember a lot of other things. I had no idea why my dad and my uncle were part of the group that were taken away, but on reading Ken Adachi's book, he says that the government was afraid that some of the younger people would become rabble-rousers, and that was the reason why the men were taken away and the women and children were left. Now, according to Ken Adachi's book, and I like this quote, United Church Missionaries showed up in Scriber and said to the men, you know you're not prisoners of war, you don't have to stay here. And so I have no idea, I didn't have any idea what happened, how they got out, until my mother died, and I found some letters. And the first letter was written to Austin Taylor, BC Security Commissioner, and it's from W. Lips from Englewood, Ontario. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he was in need of farm help. And he couldn't get it in Ontario because of the war and all the men gone. He says, I have a large dairy farm, 100 head of purebred jerseys, and I have to take 250 loads of hay and all this. He goes on and on. And so he says, I have on my farm a free house, which the Japanese could live in. He wants one married couple and one single man. They could board themselves. He'll pay $35 monthly, and that's until October. And then he'll pay $25 after that, plus $15 living cost of bonus. He'll furnish the house and give 1 quart of milk daily, free firewood, and a potato crop, and 10 bags of potato. Anyway, I found this letter, and now I understand how my dad and my uncle ended up there. Next letter. My uncle, I guess, said he wanted to take my dad with him and both families. So he says, as a matter of fact, 2 families could live in the house quite easily. And then the wages which I have would in the letter to Mr. Austin would be the same. So he'd only pay for 1 person, but 2 could live there. And I do remember living going there and living on the farm. And then this next letter is a letter from the British Columbia Security Commission to my aunt, and it's sent to Notch Hill, British Columbia, and it's the letter that will constitute authority to leave Notch Hill and travel to Englewood, Ontario to join your husband and remain there in the employ of Mr. Lips. So in order to do all this, government had to approve all this movement around. And then the next letter, I close here with a letter your in-law, Mr. Teshima, have written to Mr. Austin Taylor and Ms. Hawkins in order that 2 women will come as soon as possible. I trust you will be better, and it didn't make any sense, this letter, be here to help me out with work. And it's from Lips. And then the letter that from the British Columbia Security Commission to permit my uncle to travel to Englewood, Ontario via Brampton to work on the farm on his own at his own traveling expenses, and he's to meet Mr. Lips at Brampton on his arrival. Now, all this was all new to me, and I didn't ask any questions when I was younger. I had no idea how they got the permission to do all this, but these letters all came out as a result of my mother's death and going through some papers, so it was quite interesting because he just didn't pop up and move around, obviously. I can recall, and I don't know why I recall this, but I can recall riding in a train full of soldiers and going through the Rockies with my mother and my aunt, and this was on our trip from BC to Ontario. I don't know why I can remember this, but it's in my mind. I remember sitting in this train and all these soldiers are all around us, and I remember looking out the window at how beautiful the Rocky Mountains were as a kid, which I had no idea why. Anyway, we ended up on the farm, and the only thing that I could remember being on the farm was that I stupidly spent too much time outside one day and got sunstroke. And this part my mother told me, and I guess I was pretty well out of it. And the doctor came and he said, well, if he makes it through the night, he'll be fine. If he doesn't make it through the night, you're going to lose him. And that's all it was said, and I guess I made it. Sometimes I wonder, but when next thing I knew, we were in Toronto, and I asked my mother, just out of curiosity, years later, why did we ever leave Lips Farm? And the reason she said was that the men were treated like slaves, and they decided that two of them were doing the work and being paid for one person, and the man was not very nice to work with, so somehow they ended up in Toronto. We ended up in Toronto. Now, I have very few memories of Toronto, except I can remember coming down the stairs in the hotel and seeing cobblestone highway, road down below. And I asked my aunt that many years later, and she told me the name of the hotel. I can't remember, and what street it was, and it's no longer cobblestone, but we did live in a hotel for a period of time. And the only other thing that I can remember being in Toronto was that we were going into Chinatown one time to have dinner, and all I can remember is this guy yelling, no, no servey, no servey, no servey. And I can remember this vividly. The Chinese wouldn't serve us in Chinatown at that time. Anyway, somehow on the government postings, my uncle and my dad applied for jobs. My uncle got a job as a custodian at the University of Toronto, and my dad got a job at Beamsville Basket and Veneer Company. That's what it was called at that time. And Bill Reed was the owner. And so, because of Dad's background in working in a lumber mill, he was supposed to have been, well, I'll tell you what the other family working for the Beamsville Basket and Veneer Company, this is from the Beamsville Express on September the 23rd, 1942. The title was Japs Arrive at Beamsville. The other family working for the Beamsville Basket and Veneer Company are a young couple and their child, 4 years old. The man operated a large sawmill in British Columbia previous to the war. No, he just worked at one. And then somewhere in here it goes on to say that, oh yes, all these Japs were born in Canada and very highly educated and were members of the United Church of Canada, British Columbia, and all speak good English. No. I didn't speak much English at all. because I grew up in a community of all Japanese people. And it was interesting because as a result of all that, I have no background in it, and we were the only Japanese family around for quite a while. Other families were there working for Prudhoms, but they didn't last long, and since working for Prudhoms would be seasonal, they were there and then they were gone. Now, why did my dad and mom stay this long? Well, what happened was we were on a farm out towards Vineland, and when we arrived, and Bill Reed built a house for my dad and mom. His house was on Mountain Street in Beamsville, and he had a large lot that extended down to Hickson Street, and so a house was built on Hickson Street on the corner of his lot. And so I guess my dad felt some obligation to him because most Japanese families that came through Beamsville were there to work on Prudhoms Farm or other farms around, and they didn't last long. My dad worked at the factory. He was a veneer lathe operator, and the Reeds were very kind to us. As a kid, I grew up working at the basket factory. I always was given a quarter if inspectors were around. Take your kid, go over to the barber shop and get a Coke, and we'll come back and get you if there were inspectors around, because I was underage. But that's what happened as I was growing up. And the other interesting thing too is that the same day that they announced our arrival, Beamsville Council passed a motion Chester Elmer, that the Council of Village of Beamsville do vigorously oppose the transfer of Japanese people to this district, and that the proper authorities be petitioned to remove those who are already here. And so this is a copy of the resolution that was forwarded to municipal councils of Lincoln for their endorsement also. Now, the interesting part of that is that Chester Elmer became the, I don't know whether he was at this time or not, but he became the postmaster in Beamsville. And while I was in high school, one day I was at the post office picking up mail, and Chester came to me and he said, "Ken, would you like a job for the Christmas rush?" And I said, "What's that?" And doing what? He said, "Well, the Christmas rush, we get a lot of postcards and things. But we'd like to come in and work in the post office, and we'll pay you, and you just put letters in the mailboxes." Fine, I love that. Later on, once I was getting up mail, and a new post office had been built in Beamsville. If you're familiar with Beamsville, you know that the old one was down in the middle of town, and now the new one was at the corner of Ontario Street and King Street. And when that was built, Chester came to me one day and he said, "Would you like a job?" I said, "A job doing what?" He said, "At the post office, I need a postal clerk." And I'm still in high school. One of my repeating years, I think. And so I said to him, "What would I do?" And he said, "Well, you'd be a clerk, you'd be working back, selling stamps and meeting people, delivering mail and things like that." So I remember going home and saying to my mother and father, "I've been offered a job at the post office. It's going to pay me $2,100 a year." And my mother and father looked at me and they said, "Where?" And I explained it to them. And they said, "Only on two conditions." And I said, "What are the two conditions?" And my dad said, "Number one, you don't buy a car for a year. And number two, when you're ready to go back to high school, you say you want to go back." I said, "Well, you can forget the second one. I don't want to go back. And why can't I buy a car for a year?" They said, "Just, you can use our car, don't buy a car for a year." Okay, I could agree with that. So back I went yes, I'll take the job. So I quit school, took the job. By the time summer came along, the guys are coming in, the ball team is ready, and I can't go all the time because I'm working. Well, that hurt. August came along and the guys are saying, hey, we're going to have a good football team next year. And it was my year to be quarterback. I'm sure I was. So therefore, I went to Chester and I said, I think I got to quit. Well, Ken, you can't quit for a month because it's a government job. Okay. He says, I'll tell you what I'll do. You can don't have a day off, and at 3 o'clock on the days you have football practice, you could go. And so that's how I ended up back at school again. So, life kind of goes around in circles, and I could thank, and if you were just to read the Beamsville Express, you'd think, well, this guy obviously didn't like us, and yet he became a real good friend. And so you never know as you're growing up what's going to happen. As we grew up, the Reeds were a very good family. There were 3 girls, and they were a fairly wealthy family in Beamsville, so I got rides in their convertible all over as I was growing up. Donna took me to Beamsville Public School before I was of age to go to a party, and then she took me when I was in grade 1. And growing up in Beamsville as a young Japanese kid, I was different, but so many families were treated us very well, and I guess when I look back at it, I couldn't have picked a better town than Beamsville to grow up in, because everybody, well, there were obviously some that I didn't get along with, but they were all so helpful. The Stewart family, the Teffs, these are people from the church that I can remember. The Prudhoms, George's wife was always at the church. I grew up with the Dawes and the Johanneses, and on our own street we had the Martins and the Tolmans and the Corneliuses and the Pollards and the Jinnipers and the Reeds. They were all kids that I grew up with, and when I look back at it, it was like probably a movie script in that I got along with most of them. And my grade 1 teacher, Miss Monsinger, was super nice to me. She took me under her wing, and I remember we went out shelling walnuts one night after school and things like that. And when I think back to where I could have gone up, grown up, I don't think I could have picked a better place than Beamsville, and so it always has a special spot for me. Now, as a result of all this, my dad was offered a job by Bill Reed at the Mount Forest Basket and Casket Factory, and because he had sold the basket factory himself, and so he approached my dad, and so we had a big family vote, and I think I'm in grade 10, and my sister was 5 years younger than I am. But anyway, the vote was 2 definite no's. we were not ready to move from Beamsville, and so as a result of that, Beamsville was my home until I started work. What are the advantages of what happened? Well, as a result of all this, we have no ghettos. There's no Japanese ghettos anymore. Like there's no Chinatown or something like that. The assimilation has taken place more than one would expect, I guess. And from that point of view, I think it's a plus. I was my wife is back there. I was one of the first in our family to marry a non-Japanese, and from my generation, most of my older cousins did not do that, but the younger ones all pretty well have done that. And I personally, I think it's a plus, because, well, I have no way of explaining it other than, yes, that's something that's happened. I don't think there's anything that I've left out that I wanted to say. I'm open for questions at this point if there are any. Yes?
You still speak Japanese?
I'm sorry?
You still speak Japanese or understand?
I never spoke Japanese. In fact, my daughter is here, and we took conversational Japanese at Niagara District High School one year. And the teacher said to me, "Ken, are you sure you're Japanese?" Because the language that I would have spoken would have been pretty basic, like I'm hungry, 5 years old, and so as a result, no, I don't speak Japanese at all. Anything else? Yes?
Have you maintained any of the friendships from your high school days or after that, Ken, that still live in Beamsville now?
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you
These
say.
masks, I know. Do you have any people that you still associate with from your earlier days that still live in Beamsville now?
No, because most of my friends that I grew up with no longer live in Beamsville. Now, from high school days, a couple, and in fact, there's one here now that I hadn't seen in 20, 30 years. He was my center in football. Jay is here, and he had to introduce himself.
6 years. Sorry.
But no, anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever have aspirations to go back, like to go to Japan?
Oh, okay, no. I did remember. After seeing Roots, I wanted to go back to see my roots. So I bought a 16-foot house trailer, packed up my two girls. My youngest daughter had just graduated from kindergarten, and she had a broken arm. And we went west, and we found our way through the provinces and got to British Columbia, and got out to Great Central Lake, and drove up, and I can't see anything, but I recognized there were 2 or 3 houseboats sitting there, and I knocked at the door, and I told her who I was, and I said, I think there was a lumber mill here. She said, oh yes. She said, after the Japanese left, the Mennonites ran the lumber mill, and then now it's being reforested by McMillan Bloedel. So I said, where were the homes? And she said, over there, up there. So I thought, oh, well, okay. So I climbed up this little knoll, and I found fish ponds and things from where the houses were. This is the big hill that I remember running down to meet my dad. It was no higher than the top of that sign. But I remember it as being a big steep hill as I was growing up. And so it was kind of a disappointment, but that was an interesting trip. We did more than just that, but that was part of my roots adventure. Yes, ma'am?
So where are your parents buried? In Beamsville or?
Okay. The Teshimas, I had never met the Teshimas until after the war, and they came and lived with us and are buried in Beamsville. And it took me a while to understand that I had all these grandparents, because I knew that my mother's parents never left Japan, and I knew that my grandmother, Sumi, lived in Toronto with my dad's eldest brother. And so when they came to live with us, that's when my father had to explain to me why they were grandparents, even though blood-wise we're not related. And the Teshimas are buried in Beamsville. In fact, he has a picture of the tombstone. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming out.